which inevitably ends up benefiting the university and benefiting the people employed by the university who are of higher status or preferred positions of power. So we're advocating for a neutral system that exists outside of the university so that we can actually have justice for people who are harassed by their principal investigators if they're in a lab, people who encounter harassment from faculty advisors. We basically want to ensure that there's some way for people to get justice when they're experiencing some sort of discrimination. So those are our big asks. So of course we have other components of our organizing that you can kind of find out more if you want to go on our website. But generally, I think something that's important to emphasize is how much the university has tried to undermine our efforts. This semester, they have completely restructured the way in which we are paid as graduate students in order to make it more difficult for people to strike, basically using financial precarity as a mechanism to undermine our collective organizing. We used to receive a larger portion of our stipend that is said to be for our status as students at the beginning of the semester, but now it has been distributed over the course of the semester to make it more difficult for people to save up money in order to strike. We think this is a direct retaliation from the strike that we had in the previous semester, and it has only emboldened us further to continue to fight. But I think it's something that as supporters, you all should be aware of, that Columbia is very antagonistic towards what we were doing. And then finally, we know that Columbia will always try to offer a piecemeal solution to the things that we are struggling for. When we advocated for this neutral system of arbitration prior, they tried to basically restructure their in-house arbitration by way of the last contract. But we were able to see through this and acknowledge that they were trying to maintain their own power in the negotiations. I think we were all heartened by our union coming together and voting down the last contract that was offered to us by Columbia because it was not what we needed and not what we deserved. And the organizing that went into that in the spring has just continued into the present. And we're happy to see that the no vote that we successfully accomplished inspired other unions to similarly vote down contracts that were offered to them that were not for what they deserve. So just to conclude, I'd say a couple things about how you can support if you're interested. First, if you're here and you are a union member, you can sign into the digital picket line and then get hours for your strike pay. If you would like the link in order to do that right now, you can do it on your phone. I'll give everyone a second if you're getting out your phones. Ready? Okay. So it is bit.ly/SWC_digital_picket. I'll say it one more time. bit.ly/SWC_digital_picket. So if you need to sign in to get hours, you can do that. Second, if you'd like to contribute to our hardship fund, which is basically the money we raise in order to support people who need more than what the union can offer us as supplemental pay with our pay and stipends being cut by the university, you can contribute to the hardship fund at bit.ly/CU_on-strike. And then finally, the other actions that you can take is, of course, coming to the picket line in person. Tomorrow we will be up at the medical center, and we're really trying to build solidarity across Columbia campuses because oftentimes the student workers in the medical school don't have the same connection because they're on a physically removed campus. So we'd love to see you come out to the medical school tomorrow. And also, finding ways to pressure the university through drawing attention to the ways in which they're undermining our labor efforts and they're undermining our ability to organize. We think that shame is a great motivating factor, and we hope to continue shaming the university. Yes?
David, the link you just told us about doesn't work.
For
The link to the hardship fund?
the CU on strike?
Yeah, that is not, I just checked it, it doesn't work.
With bit.ly?
Yeah.
Huh, okay. Someone sent me that one and said it worked. So if you Google Columbia Student Workers Hardship Fund, it's the first link there. Quite easy in that sense. So we can thank our benevolent tech overlords, or not. But that's all I have to say. Thank you all, and we appreciate this event so much. And thank you both for letting me talk about the union for a second.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Thank you for all of your work and for all of the assistance from everyone at the union to help us get this location and work with David Chung here at the People's Forum. It's been really great, but there are a lot of people behind the scenes who made this possible. Ava, Amelia, just Gabriel, and of course Fonda, Shen. So thank you to all of you. So we're here tonight to discuss the collective's statement, and we're here to discuss it with Kianga Yamata-Taylor, and it's a real privilege, because I couldn't think of a better person to discuss these issues with. And not only because Kianga edited the book that we are reading and wrote the brilliant introduction and conducted the interviews with the authors of the statement, Barbara Smith and Beverly Smith and others and folks today. But because Kianga is truly brilliant and the recipient most recently this year of a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Fellowship. Kianga joins us this evening from Princeton, where she's a professor in the Department of African American Studies. As you all know, she wrote and edited and interviewed the authors in How We Get Free. And one of the things I loved when the union put us in contact with the People's Forum, and I went to the website of the People's Forum, and on the bottom of the website of the People's Forum is something about the library, and the picture is two young women holding up this book, you know, and it was just like, oh man, that's perfect. We are spot on at the right place. And this book won the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ Nonfiction 2018. And of course, that's just the stars lined up. Kianga is also the author of two other important books. The first is Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership, which was actually a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer in history. Also, From Black Lives to Black Liberation, which is an extraordinary recounting of the movement, just one of the leading scholars on race and racial inequality and the various ways that Black communities have been challenged and have resisted these constraints. She's also a contributing editor to The New Yorker. There were two of The New Yorker articles that I put on the post there, really extraordinary and really helpful. Go to the blog, to the website for Revolution 413, and you can link onto there as well. Now, before we jump into the conversation, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about Revolution 1313 for those of you who are coming in from the People's Forum or from a different space, since we're kind of coming together today from Columbia and from the People's Forum. The idea of Revolution 1313 was really to interrogate, who we read, who we think with, when we think about critique and praxis. The line of questioning was launched by my friend and colleague, Biodun Jayifo, who also launched the first Revolution 113 with me. And the line of questioning really was about, do we have a tendency, particularly at a place like Columbia, to focus too much on the kind of academic critical philosophers and not pay enough attention to what BJ calls worldly philosophers, or what we might call revolutionary philosophers, or thinkers like the Combahee River Collective, who are, situated in an interesting way to the academy, and we're going to have a conversation about that, but not centrally there. And then what does that bring? And that's the question. Like, what work does it do to kind of focus on these different spaces of critique and praxis? The first session we were looking at the Paris, Rome, and Bandung conferences. We were looking a lot at Frantz Fanon's work in relationship to that, and the work that came out of that, including Wretched of the Earth. At the second one, with Adam Getachew, we looked at Kwame Nkrumah's work, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, and then last session, we were really focusing on Gramsci and Sartre with Etienne Balibar. And in that session, we kind of developed this idea of the engaged philosopher who sits somewhere in between, and with reference, of course, to Sartre. That has presented a number of questions about, what difference is there in the critical interventions that we find in this work? What is it about the location of the individual? What is it about one's personal implication in struggle and revolution that may differ? And overall, this raises a lot of questions of identity, which I think are precisely raised in the collective statement, the Combahee River Collective, and that we're going to touch on tonight and try and think about. So let me turn it over to you, Kianga, to kick us off, and then at some point I might interrupt you. Everyone is pretty versed in the background on the Combahee River Collective. They've read your introduction, which does an extraordinary job of locating it, and there's also an introduction, a separate introduction on the website for Revolution 413. So, first of all, though, thank you for joining us.
Oh, no, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, this is I think this is the first public thing I've done with people since 2020. So thank you for, yeah, no, this is a good thing to talk about. So I just wanted to open with some kind of broad introductory comments just to help shape the conversation. And the first thing I wanted to say was about why I wrote this book, or why I put this book together, How We Get Free. And it really emerged out of the first book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, where it was clear when looking at the kind of first wave of Black Lives Matter in 2014, 2015, that a lot of the young Black women organizers in places like Ferguson and in Oakland, and really, people doing grassroots organizing had been drawn to the statement as a source of politics and understanding for, a history of their own circumstance and condition. And so I wanted to then look at the statement on its on its own terms, and to talk to the women who wrote it, to see what we could, what I could learn and figure out from the context and period within which they wrote it, and how that made sense in the lives and organizing of these young working class Black women in 2014, 2015. So that was my own motivation around this particular book. And so the second thing is, why is it popular? It's still, it has been republished in one form or another at least 30 times from 1980 to 2017. It is a popular reference point for activists. And so I think I have 4 or 5 quick reasons, not reasons, but things that I think about in terms of its popularity. The first one is that it's a political statement. It is, not just a kind of emotional reflection on a particular set of circumstances, but it's a statement of politics and analysis, and really an effort to try to make sense structurally and materially of the conditions engulfing Black women in the 1970s. And so related to that is that it clearly identifies the source of Black women's oppression is rooted in capitalism. And I think that's important, and I'll come back to, I mean, this is a lot of what we're going to talk about, but I was saying to Bernard earlier, that it's interesting in all of the, particularly in 2017, which was the 40th anniversary of the statement, almost all of the celebrations of the Combahee Statement are about it as an origin story for identity politics, and almost nothing about it as a document of socialism and anti-capitalism. And so, but I do think that at least for some portion of people who are drawn to the statement, is that it is an anti-capitalist document and unapologetically socialist. It clearly identifies and articulates the ways that Black women experience oppression. And so in doing so, it clearly explains why Black women's oppression is not reducible just to gender or race, but it clearly explicates the particularity of Black women's experience, whether that is as victims of rape and domestic abuse, what they talk about in terms of social stigmatization, smart, ugly, and sterilization, and the constraints placed on Black women's reproductive rights. But they do so not in a navel-gazing or proprietary way, that these are our struggles, these are our oppressions that no one can understand, and therefore no one is invited into the struggle against them, but really as a way of trying to understand their motivations around politics. And so in that sense, they are articulating what they describe as identity politics, not as grievance, but as a source of knowing, of power, and a source of solidarity. I think one of the last things in terms of its importance, and this might just be to me, but I think that it, in subtle ways, but in smart ways, anticipates what I would describe as the class turn in Black politics and the experience of Black people, particularly in the 1980s. Obviously, class is always a feature of the experiences of Black people, but there's something specific that they're identifying when they invoke tokenism in the statement. And what they're talking about are the ways that the success of a very small layer of Black people is held up to both legitimize the system of capitalism, is to dismiss the enormity of suffering in Black communities as the product of their own behavior or family structure. And I think by talking about tokenism and inserting this in the document, that it helps to distill what later becomes unavoidable in understanding, particularly in the 1980s, and the way that the emergence of a small but significant and visible Black elite and Black political class, whose mere presence is used to discipline a much larger section of poor and working class Black people, is an important insight there. I think the final issue or contribution that I think is part of not just what makes this document important, but also is part of, I think, why people gravitate towards it, is an optimism that is not fake and is not contrived, but is one that is born out of solidarity and the need for revolutionary action, as these are tangible ways in which the circumstance of Black people and other oppressed people can transform. And so it's sober in that sense, that it's not just making kind of unrealistic proclamations of we need a revolution or revolution now, but it's rooted in a history of Black oppression, an analysis of that, and a way in which the struggles of Black women can connect to the struggles of other people, and that becomes the basis for a complete transformation of American society. And so I think, these are some of the insights I think that the document provides, but is one of the reasons why it continues to be a document that people, radicals, revolutionaries, return to over and over again, not only because of the continuity of the conditions that they evoke, but also I think because of its sobriety and because of its rootedness and analytical capability of explaining both how we are in this situation and how we can emerge out of it. So I'll just stop there by way of introduction.
Excellent, thanks. Thanks so much, Kianga. Let me pick up on I've got 3 points in reaction to your presentation. I want to pick up on the first one first, which is this, what you were suggesting, like identity politics is what gets picked up in 2017 and not the kind of socialism side of the statement, which is particularly interesting, and I want to push in 2 directions. One, of course, is why is that now? But then also I want to talk a little bit about identity politics, or at least the way in which it's formulated here, and how there are useful ways in which to think about it today as a result of this statement. But the first one is kind of like, so why is it that the anti-capitalist side was kind of, buried in a way, or is not highlighted today? I mean, I take it, on the one hand, it's the right critique of identity politics, so it's just using this as a target, really. This becomes the target. This is the text, apparently, that was the first one that used the words identity politics, and so it becomes the target, and also because of the way it's written and the way there are affirmations of claiming identities that's done in the writing. We can talk about that. But also from the left, or from the liberal side, I think the reason that the socialism is not highlighted is because it gets de-radicalized in a way. The text is getting de-radicalized in its uptake today. And so let's talk a little bit about that. What is the source, do you think, of that de-radicalization that happens from the friendlier side of a left, liberal left mostly, here?
So there are two things I think about, both of which might be a provocation. So the first one is a little bit of what I was talking about in terms of why I wrote the book. So I think the revival around identity politics in some ways comes out of the desire for these Black women organizers to have a defense, to find, like a defense of what they describe as identity politics when it is coming under such withering attack, this concept of identity politics, both from the right, but also among liberals, especially in 2016, in 2017 when, liberals, their hair is on fire, that Trump is running, and that we have to kind of cobble together this coalition embodied through Hillary Clinton to keep him out. And they are, you've got black activists trailing Hillary Clinton all around the country, reminding her that at one point in 1996, she described young black people as super predators, and how is she going to account for that? And so, there's an attack on the idea of identity politics. And so for many of these organizers, this is a way to kind of understand their experience and to really find a usable past or history of identity politics, and to have a defense of the idea that black people can organize on their own terms and don't have to seek the permission of other people, or don't have to do so in ways that make other people, white people in particular, comfortable. And so, I think that is part of why there's a celebration of that aspect of identity politics, even though it's a complete distortion of what the women in the Combahee Collective conceived of as identity politics, was really about understanding how black women's experience of oppression radicalized them and became a kind of entry point into politics. It meant that the personal as political was not a retreat away from politics, as it may have been for liberal white women in the 1970s, but it was the opposite. It was actually an exit into political activism by looking at the internal experiences that black women experience was inherently political, because it put them in confrontation with the state. It put them in confrontation with power. And so that was different from a kind of invocation of identity politics as almost as an acceptance and celebration of marginalization, of rejection in some ways, of solidarity. But it was also during a different time, right? So I think that for the women of Combahee, especially the women who wrote the statement, Barbara and Beverly Smith and Demita Frazier. Barbara Smith had been extremely active in SDS and CORE, or Beverly had been active in CORE, and Demita Frazier had been involved with the Black Panther Party. And I think in general, they came out of a political period where, of course, there were enormous political fractures and disputes, especially by the early 1970s. But there was also moments in which they had themselves experienced solidarity between different groups of oppressed people. And so in many ways, those politics came out of their political and organizing experiences. So it wasn't a statement, it wasn't an abstract statement to talk about the need for solidarity, as well as the fact that by the time that this statement is published in 1978, we are well past the tail end of the movements of the 1970s, that there is no other way, right? There is no other way except through some form of coalition politics to actually begin to deal with what will become Reaganism, but you can see its foreshadowing even in the late 1970s. By the 2014, 15, 16, I think this idea of political unity, solidarity, is a complete abstraction. There's nothing you can point to that says this is a politics that we should subscribe to and organize around. So that in the later context, it's a kind of, it's racism, right? This is why people cling to this idea of organizing on the margins, organizing among ourselves, organizing in a way that you may or may not be able to organize with us, is in some ways a reaction to the virulence of racism in American society.
Yeah. So, I mean, the context, so we've put a few different kind of reactions on the map here already. So there's the right critique. We were talking just now about a liberal critique, which I take as kind of like the Mark Lila response, which is in the materials, and with all the references and links and whatnot. But the 2016 Mark Lila, which I view as a kind of white liberal response, right? But then there's also a transformation of black feminism that takes place. So there's also another context within which identities are being embraced or not embraced, or cleansed or de-radicalized, right, in a certain way. And so there's a way in which there's identity politics is being completely misunderstood at the level, say, of the, Bannon characterization, somewhat misunderstood in the context of the Mark Lila, and we can come back to that. But there's also a way in which it's being transformed within black feminism itself, right?
So let me just first say, I don't think it's misunderstood by Bannon or even Mark Lila. I think it's distorted, and its distortion comes out of a kind of political rejection of the premise. So the right has cobbled together identity politics, critical race theory, the notion of structural racism, and reject them outright, because to accept any of that is to unravel their entire worldview of the United States, both domestically and internationally. And so the idea that there is the organized oppression of black people or other non-white people in this society completely shatters any notion of the US as the exceptional nation. For liberals, I think that because they still, believe that the governing institutions of the country are salvageable, that identity politics strikes them as overly pessimistic, and so those are distortions, not just misunderstandings of the meaning, and to the extent that they may be misunderstood, it's willful. But I do think that if we look at the kind of celebrations, the 40th anniversary, whether it's at the NWSA, the National Women's Studies Association, the kind of journal articles, roundtables about Combahee, that there is a kind of systematic might be an overstatement, but there is a regular kind of diminution of socialism, anti-capitalism in these kind of revivals of Combahee. And so I think part of that has to do with the ways that black feminism has changed itself as a political idea, which is to say that, the black feminists of the late 1960s and 1970s, I mean, aside from the context within which they were writing, there was an implicit assumption that black feminism was radical because the vast majority of black women were poor and working class, and their political conclusions about why that was and what to do about it led them to radical conclusions. So there wasn't a kind of distinction of black feminism and radical black feminism. There was no middle-class black feminist expression. Now, black feminist, in the same way that many other currents of the radical left of the 1960s and 70s, goes into the academy as a way to continue to engage in politics and debate, to be in a space to talk about ideas and to think about things, to be intellectual without the weight of the state bearing down on them. And so I think one of the things that we have to examine is the way that the entry of the kind of leading lights of black feminism, in many ways led by Barbara Smith, who sees it as part of her role to create black women's studies as a kind of unit of inquiry, the ways that that distorts the black feminist project. And I think that that has consequences for the de-radicalization of black feminism. By the time we come to the 40th anniversaries of the Combahee that want to celebrate its queerness and its feminism, while at the same time downplaying its radicality and its seeing itself as part of a Marxist tradition that must be extended, but as part of a Marxist tradition nonetheless.
And so I suppose those are precisely the dimensions of kind of institutionalization in a way that, that in part this whole seminar series, Revolution 1313, is trying to get at. Like, what are the ways in which the placement within a particular institution can then water down or eliminate some of the more radical aspects of the critical theory. And I mean, here it sounds as if part of the transformation was becoming, becoming acceptable in a certain way in order to be a part of the academic discourse of Black women's studies, or being more acceptable or palatable. I mean, in other words, so that's where, and I suspect that the sexuality dimensions and the kind of explicit embrace of lesbianism in this book also gets kind of watered down. I mean, you're focusing mostly on the socialism and the anti-capitalism, but I sense that some of that other dimension gets watered down as well over time.
I think that, I mean, there's a few things. I think that, yeah, the specificity of lesbianism certainly changes, but I do think that there is a part of the appeal is the queerness within the document itself. And so I do think that that is something that has held up. And, I think there are, I don't want to say that it's just the institutionalization that produces this effect, because I don't necessarily think that that's wholly true, although I do think that as it becomes institutionalized, I don't think it's just a question of respectability and being palatable. I think that, the thing that happens with class transformation is that your concerns shift. They're different. If you're no longer, with, as they describe, at the bottom of society, where, the political questions that emerge from the bottom are of necessity, and they lead to certain kinds of confrontations. Those questions change when you're no longer in that position. And that's not a moral dilemma. That is the essence of materiality, right? That being determines consciousness, and the being is transforming. And so the questions and the concerns transform with it. That, maybe we can have that conversation about institutionalizing Black feminism within the institution. But that is also, I think we have to also think about what is happening outside of the institution as well, which is to say that this issue of tokenism, it's not an abstraction just about class within the Black community, but there are particular figures. And so the one that always comes to mind for me, especially around 2016, 2017, is Michelle Obama, right? Who is kind of self-packaged as, especially with the autobiography or whatever that was, Becoming, which is held up as some kind of quintessential experience, up to a certain point of a certain generation of Black women. And, if Michelle Obama and Beyonce are embracing the moniker of feminism, then what does that do to its politics? And so that's also part of it. As I was saying before, that in the 1960s and 1970s, there was no distinction between Black feminism and a radical Black feminism. Of course, there's the NBFO, which was more kind of like, aspiring middle-class Black women. But on the whole, there was an understanding that Black feminism had an inherently radical character to it. That changes over time as the position and the presentation of a small but highly visible layer of Black women in positions of power and authority become the kind of physical face of what it means to be Black women in the United States. And so you see that with Michelle Obama, Kamala Harris, and the various kinds of women Black women who are in positions of power, who are far and few between, but who receive disproportionate profile and coverage, as if to say something more general about the condition of Black women. And so I think that is also part of the distortion when it comes to understanding how the questions that animated Black feminism at the end of the 1960s, the Third World Women's Alliance, how that changes when you have Black women in charge of the empire.
Right. So let's turn then to the second point you were making, which ties directly to kind of the substance of the idea of identity politics in this text, as it, and of course as it relates to the way in which there are these transformations over time. But you had mentioned the source, that what it was about was a kind of a source of knowing, of power, of solidarity. And so that touches on the dual nature, at least, or the different layers in the theory of identity politics that is in this statement. The first one, which you referenced, of course, is this idea that there's a personal dimension, one's own identity pushes one in particular political directions, right? That was, and that's, you mentioned that, that's how there's a lot of discussion of that. Then there's this other dimension that you're trying to talk about here in terms of solidarity, which is the idea, I think this is tied to the statement in the statement that basically says, if we protect Black women, everyone will be protected in a way, right? There's a famous line. I'll
When
find
Black
it.
women are free, everyone
Yeah, exactly.
will have to be free.
Right. And So, right, so it's on 2223 for everybody who has the text. If black women are free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. Okay, and now that's a different layer of identity politics here, which is not as tied to claiming one's own identity, but to understanding systems of oppression working along certain axes. And I take it that that's really important, because it's by working along those axes that one can create solidarity. In other words, other people should also be in a coalition, because, right, those are the dimensions that would result in everyone being free. And so I take it that's a second layer of identity politics in this text, but it's a second layer that plays an enormous role then, and could play an enormous role today still, in coalition politics.
Can you hand me that other book?
This one.
Yeah.
Sure.
There's a great quote in here from King that I think, that to me really makes sense of the, if black women were free, then everyone else would be free. Okay. This is King, it's a testament of hope. It was an essay published after his death in Playboy in 1969. In these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all of its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing the evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws, and suggests that the radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced. And there's another from C.L.R. James. Okay. So this is from C.L.R. James on the, I think it's on the Negro question. It's like 1941. And he writes, quote, "Let us not forget that in the Negro people, there sleep and are now awakening passions of a violence exceeding, perhaps as far as these things can be compared, anything among the tremendous forces that capitalism has created. Anyone who knows them, who knows their history, is able to talk to them intimately, watches them at their own theaters, watches them at their dances, watches them in their churches, reads their press with a discerning eye, must recognize that although their social force may not be comparable with the social force of a corresponding number of organized workers, the hatred of bourgeois society and the readiness to destroy it when the opportunity should present itself rests among them to a greater degree, to a degree greater than any other section of the population of the United States." And so I think what the Combahee women are tapping into as it relates to Black women are the ways that the experiences of Black women, the particularity of those experiences expose aspects of the system or the systems of oppression and exploitation. It illuminates and showcases them in ways that other struggles simply can't, which is why you can't just say that, you know, we can look at the struggles of white women and understand the depths of oppression and exploitation in capitalism, or we can just look at the struggles of Black men and understand the depths of oppression and exploitation in capitalism. But for them, it's looking at the experiences of Black women that truly show the depths of oppression and exploitation of capitalism, but also show that they can't simply be reformed because they are constitutive of capitalism itself. And so I think that those three observations are looking at the ways that the struggles of Black people in particular expose certain dimensions of capitalism that otherwise cannot be seen. And so what the women of Combahee are contributing to this in extending this understanding is to say, but really you have to look at the conditions of Black women in particular. And that is asking more than even what King was identifying, what C.L.R. James before him was identifying, but they are pointing to something else that is more specific.
Yeah, I think two points are important here. So one has to do with, I'd say, the liberal critique, which in a way fails to understand that notion of solidarity, I think, at the heart of identity politics. I think this is important, that the liberal critique is a critique that, well, we're all, it's kind of like this really zero-sum game. It's either, if it's good for white people, it's not going to be good for Black people. If it's good for Black women, it's not going to be good for white people, or something like that. And in part, I think that's the whole kind of strategic argument that's made by the white liberal against the notions of identity politics. It's all strategic. It's like we're not going to be able to get votes from the, moderate whites in the middle or something because they feel as if anything that is gained for Black women is a loss for them, right? And so it's a complete misunderstanding of the idea of coalition politics being not about a zero-sum game or not about internal competition for material advancement, but instead kind of coalition politics about being an enterprise, about protecting everyone, and that's best achieved by focusing on the most vulnerable persons. And so I think that's one of the important errors that the critique of identity politics makes. But then it also raises this interesting question, which is the eventual transformation of who is at the margin, or who is kind of needing most protection. Because I think at the time that this was written, there isn't, so sexuality is important here, and a critique of heteropatriarchy is important here, but transgender issues is not on the, it doesn't feel as if it's on the radar screen yet, of course, whatever, as Jack Halberstam writes about clearly in Trans, right? It wasn't on the radar, right? And disability, so persons with who are disabled by society, is also something that's not really on the radar here.
Yeah.
Now those become much more, those are the issues today that we are focused on. And then what's interesting is, does the same focus, which in a way here it was Black women, if we center Black women, we are also protecting issues of, or addressing issues of sexuality, addressing issues of anti-capitalism. And I think it's a successful argument here, and you see, I think, this powerfully done in this work, which also gives you at least the hope that it would also be able to extend to transgender persons or persons who are disabled. right?
Well, I think the important thing there is, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is not present in the document, but what they're doing is creating a framework that other oppressed people can use by the simple observation that no one else will fight for us except us. I mean, they say that early on in the document, that they're organizing for their own sake, and I want to find the goddamn quote now, but that.
Here, we consist. It's on page 18, bottom of page 18. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's the big evil identity politics.
Right.
This simple, straightforward truism. And so even if, the particular oppression is not listed here, that is a framework for every oppressed group, is that we must fight for ourselves because no one else will do it. So that's one thing. I think, part of the.
So let me But by doing that, we are also able to, in a way, protect everyone, right? That's a key claim here, right?
Well, yeah, because it's not, well, we want to fight for ourselves and we don't care about what happens to you. It's that there's lots of struggle that is happening, but our struggle is left out. So that is what we bring into this movement. That is what we bring into this struggle for transformation, is our issues, is our struggle, and not in isolation from other struggles, but that you should also see our struggle as important, to your struggle as well. And so that is the cynicism, really, or that's not cynical, it's the cynicism of liberals, and the idea that people either will, that no one will fight alongside anyone else. And so we have to sort of come up with big, baggy, broad categories to organize around. So for the liberal, it's the quintessential, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so we don't need to, think about your particular boat or your particular boat, that the rising tide will lift all the boats.
Right. Well, it's also a raw numerical analysis often, right? I mean, you get that sense from the Lila interventions, right? It's just kind of like numbers, like where are we going to find these numbers? And without a sense that actually, coalitions are about working together, right?
And
not in competing in a way for that.
And their sense of coalition is what is the greatest common denominator, what is the sort of least offensive way to bring people together. And so if you talk about racism, well, that, offends white people. If you talk about your particular experience of oppression, that is offensive to someone within this coalition, which breaks down the possibility for this coalition to exist. But it is always at the expense of the group that wants to talk about their own experience of oppression and its impact, right? That is where the problem lies. So when Lila, writes that we can't build a coalition this way, he's not thinking about or considering the particular experience of oppression from particular groups. There's an assumption that, well, if we can, get particular legislation or something passed that will deal with all of these problems. And I think what they are saying is that if we can't even state what the problem is, if we can't even discuss how we experience oppression, then how on earth are you going to come up with any solution that actually solves it if we're not even allowed to state it? Because to state it is to make other people uncomfortable, which is then, pointed to as the reason for the dissolution of the coalition in the first place. It means that coalition is only possible by not fighting for yourself and not fighting around your particular set of interests.
And so that takes me to the third point you were making, which has to do with this interesting optimism born out of solidarity, in a way, the optimism of this text.
Yeah.
By contrast to the kind of like overly pessimistic, I mean, this is an interesting, it's an interesting juxtaposition, unexpected. Optimism of this text, in contrast to what you were referring to as kind of like the overly pessimistic view of the liberal critique of the text, right? But I think that's entirely right, that there is this way in which there is an optimism in the text born of a unrelenting critique, and that without that critique, without the critique of the systems of oppression along racial and gender lines and sexuality and capitalism in this text, without a kind of unrelenting critique of those, there's no way to be optimistic. I mean, in other words, here I'm kind of channeling a conversation I was having this afternoon with Kendall Thomas on a beautiful walk, on a beautiful day today. It was incredible today. So I'm not sure. Maybe this was Kendall's point, and so I want to make sure to attribute it to him. But there is something about the only way to be optimistic about the future is to retain the unrelenting critique. It's not to, but if you put it aside, then there's no real hope to kind of even achieve anything that would kind of move us forward.
So I think for them, I'm not sure. I don't know if they would, in real time, have described this as optimistic. But I do think at the very end, it might even be the last sentence of the statement, that it feels very duty-bound, that, this is hard, but this is what we have to do, and there is no, other way than to engage in this work. And so, for me, I read it as optimism because that's sort of, one, I think that's part of its revival as well. I don't think, pessimistic statements about the impossibility of things, would be celebrated for the duration or longevity of in the ways that this has been. So that's one thing. I think that's why people are drawn to it. It's because there is something not just affirming about this kind of forthright statement in defense of Black women organizing for themselves, but to me, the optimism derives out of its ability to clearly define and articulate the nature of the problem, but also how do we get out of this in ways that are not hyperbolic, in ways that are not unrealistic, of which there was a lot of during this period, you know, but that for me, its sobriety is optimistic because it makes it seem possible, right? That hard, maybe even unlikely, but it is possible because it is rooted in the kind of everyday experiences of ordinary people. And so that, you know, in some ways it's like the Communist Manifesto, right, is not overstated and hyperbolic. It's a statement about what is happening in the world and what is happening around, but, you know, here are the ways in which this could change. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it's a statement of sobriety and fact, and I find that to be optimistic.
But there is one approach that seems more promising than another, which is to address the systems of oppression and not like elide them, not ignore them for the sake of some kind of right. Okay, so I want to pose one last question, then we're going to open it up. So and so signal to me, and I'll pass you the mic. And then also we've got folks on Zoom as well, and I've got a question already from Jay Gossett, who's a brilliant scholar who joined us at Columbia this year. But before I do, on these questions of kind of worldly philosophers versus more academically oriented critical philosophers, or possibly someone in the middle. I mean, we were talking with Etienne Balibar about this notion of the engaged philosopher with Sartre. What do you think? How would you locate the collective, and is the location related in part to its willingness to speak about its identity or throw its identity into the analysis, into the political analysis in a way?
That's an interesting question. I think on the one hand, they are very much reflect the experiences of the ordinary Black women that are really informing their politics. You know, on the other hand, part of the reason why the group split up was that some of them, especially Barbara Smith, really wanted to make a hard turn into the academy as a way of, you know, ideological, intellectual survival. And others, you know, disagreed with that, feeling, one, that, you know, this was not an option for all of these women, but also about the ways in which that turn holds the possibility of distorting the political project. So, you know, I think that places them somewhere in, you know, aspiring for something else and then being rooted in, you know, the daily realities. And I do think that the debates about where they should position themselves, I mean, these are never debates that are being had abstractly. I mean, this is, again, this document, and I think that we often lose sight of this, or I certainly often lose sight of it, is written in 1978. It's not written in 1974, where there's still the kind of vestiges of the movement are still quite tangible. By 1978, this is, you know, really not just the kind of reaction from the state has set in, but the whole notion that motivated so much of the left at the end of the 60s, that revolution was happening, it was possible, had gone, had disappeared. And even the kind of vestiges of the liberal state, the Johnsonian welfare state that Nixon, who so desperately wanted to undo, but couldn't in his first term, because of the threat of violence, because of the threat of radical violence still hung in the air. That's all gone by the time this happens. And so it's a totally different context within which to understand how these debates are taking place. So often we talk about them in abstract, should we go to the university or it's like this is a question that many radicals had to grapple with, which is how do you sustain your political ideas, your political practice, as your organizations have been destroyed by the state. There's still the threat of the state, but most importantly, the movements which gave all of this its sustenance don't exist anymore. And so what do you do? And that was part of the decision making process, and that's, I think, part of the context within which to understand this question of institutionalization and what happens. But that is the broader context within which these things are happening.
Terrific. Okay, so I'm going to start taking questions and moderating. Should I read? Jay's on Zoom, I take it? No? Okay, all right. Well, let me so Jay Gossett, who is our postdoc now at the Initiative for a Just Society at Columbia, doing incredible work. They have the following question, so I'll read this question, okay? There's a powerful line in the CRC statement that I often return to, quote, "We find biological determinism a particularly dangerous and reactionary basis upon which to build a politic," unquote. Can you talk about the Black feminist critique of biological determinism and of how this might be significant for addressing anti-trans violence, especially given the fascist, gender-critical politics so rampant in the UK right now, but also, as always, in the US, with the levels of both social and legal violence, anti-trans waves of legislation. And then secondly, and relatedly, how do you connect or see the CRC statement related to Black trans liberation struggles? Okay. So let's start there, and then also anyone who wants in, tell me. Okay, I've got you, Alyssa, and I'll pass the mic next. Okay.
I'll say a couple of things. One, I think the biological determinism comment is made in relation to separatist feminist. Lesbian separatist who, in the context of the late 60s and 1970s, separated themselves, extracted themselves from the patriarchy by, creating their own households, communities that were free of men. And so, the Combahee statement is really sort of delineating how the struggles of Black women, once again, are different, because this is, in their criticism of radical separatism, are really talking about white women who have the ability to extract themselves from their male partners or men in general. And so in the statement, it says very clearly that they are Black women who struggle in solidarity with Black men against racism, and then struggle with Black men over questions of sexism, and that because the struggle for Black women also includes a struggle against racism, that they are not in a position to abandon Black men. And so I think, you know, I think that's less about the perils of biological determinism and more about the particular strategies that they have undertaken, though I think that read within the larger context of the statement, that, you know, the Combahee River Collective are really invested in materiality and material understanding of sources of oppression. And I think that they see a kind of kinship between biological determinism and the kind of anti-Black hysteria and racism that is animating certainly their own experiences, you know, as Black women who come of age in the post-World War II era, that strike them as dangerous, that there's something dangerous about these ideas of locating oppression in biology as determinant. And so I think just you know, on the second question, you know, I would just reiterate what we discussed earlier, which is the framework that the Combahee River Collective statement establishes about the critical point of fighting for oneself and of taking one's own liberation as a starting point for entry into broader struggles against, you know, oppression and exploitation. And so I think I've lost part of the thread of the question, but
I think you were right there, which was in a way relating it to Black trans liberation struggles.
I mean, let me just say, I do think that part of the lesson that we can derive from the statement and the era that it comes from is the need for solidarity is not just a kind of, you know, a statement, but that solidarity is intentional and practiced. And these kind of, I don't know, the stuff in England with the TERFs, and I mean, it's so disgusting and antithetical to any notion of human solidarity. These attacks on trans women, trans people in general. And, you know, I think that without even getting into all of the details, if we use this statement as a starting point of the absolute necessity of solidarity between oppressed groups of people as any sort of starting point for any kind of effective politics, because I think that is one of the issues that I think gets missed from the broader left about when this notion of universalism is really the way that we can knit together movements, is not by looking at the particular struggles, but by focusing on the universal needs of oppressed people. I think what that misses is the way that oppressed people, Black people in particular, are not just simply going to enter into your big, large struggle on some abstract idea that we should all be unified with each other. The people have to see their own struggles reflected in these movements. People have to see some level of commitment to their own struggles reflected in these movements. And I think that that is a kind of very basic starting point for understanding solidarity, is a respect for the particular struggles of people who endure a specific variety of oppression and exploitation.
Thanks, Kianga. Alyssa Battistoni. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Now it's really loud. So first of all, thank you so much. This has been really great, and I really appreciate, so much everything that you've been saying, but I think particularly the attention to the political dimensions of this and the anti-capitalist dimensions, and some of the things that I agree sometimes get lost. And my question sort of, I think, falls on what you were just saying towards the end in particular. Around the question of, I guess, how to restore some of, it seems like one of the other dimensions that of the sort of the identity politics response that wasn't mentioned as much in the beginning is a sort of response not only from liberals but from the left that's a sort of against identity politics with a trying to recenter class in a way. Class versus race debates and things like that, that, as you know, I think are often very unproductive. So I'm curious, I would just love to hear more of your thoughts on like how to bring some of the class and anti-capitalist elements back into the conversations around Combahee without going down that, I think, again, distortion of identity politics line. I really love your work on Black Lives Matter for this reason. I think it's really rich in that respect, and it's really helpful. And related to that, sort of a question around the reading of when Black women are free, everyone will be free. And Bernard was talking about that as sometimes being read, or the liberal response to identity politics is sometimes a zero-sum game where like one person wins, another person loses. And while I appreciate the sort of pushback on that or the rejection of that, we probably have some cases where one person wins and someone else loses, and particularly around if you're maybe talking about, it seems like that's some of the tension around like the Democratic Party trying to have some very wealthy voters and this kind of like, or what the composition of like the Democratic Party coalition is now, where some people might actually be threatened by, a working class Black women-led organizing practice. So I'm really curious just like how you think about navigating some of that and how to restore some of those dimensions without, again, losing the really crucial heart of the critique. So yeah, thanks.
That's great. Yeah, I do think it's important to say that there's the right-wing criticism of identity politics, and then there are the kind of cynical liberal critiques of identity politics. But then there is certainly a critique of identity politics that comes from the more organized left. And I think we saw kind of I think most of these debates have taken place around, Sanders' emphasis on class issues and the kind of some of the debates within the Democratic Socialist of America, and for the greatest appeal, do we sort of focus on the issues that unite everyone as opposed to taking up or emphasizing issues that may impact particular people. And so I think part of the problem with that, again, is that it really assumes that these other people, Black and brown people, transgender people, whoever it is, will simply wait around until their issue comes up in order to participate in a movement. And I think that without a commitment to, in this case, around questions of racism, without a commitment to anti-racism, there's no real guarantee that you can actually secure the participation of ordinary Black people in a movement. And so if the objective is to build a mass movement in order to exercise the maximum pressure on the existing governing and political institutions. You can't do that by simply playing a game of what is the lowest common denominator that brings all of these groups together when the police are murdering Black people, when the Border Patrol is murdering Latinx people on the border and has a policy of separating people's families. You know, you can go on down the list, and without some kind of demonstration or commitment to these issues, it makes it hard to build that kind of mass movement. Now, is that hard to do? Yeah, it is hard to do because there's a lot of racism, if we just look at that in this country, and the idea that you have to convince ordinary white people that they have a stake in the fight against racism is complicated, but there's no other way. I don't believe there's any other way around it, because thinking that Black people will just involve themselves in a movement that ignores the fact that police are murdering Black people, or that ignores, I mean, there's a horrible statistic that 43% of African Americans who work in the private economy, right, so not for the government, make under $30,000 in the United States, right? I mean, just kind of wrap your head around that. This is the richest country in the history of the world, and you have people who are living on less than $30,000 a year. And so, you know, there's no way around dealing with the question of race and its relationship to class if you want to build a mass movement. So I will just say, what was the second part?
Around cases where somebody else might have, the kind of coalition, or where somebody might have something to lose.
Oh,
like
yeah.
the Bernard's thing, and talk about, you know, I guess maybe say, yeah, there might be some people who have something to lose. Maybe we would all be freer under the later
Yeah,
capitalism and
there's going to be some losers.
along the way.
I mean, you just can't have, you know, the billionaire class have exponentially increased their wealth during, you know, this pandemic. They exist. I mean, this is capitalism, right? The billionaires exist because there's so many poor people. So when I wrote this book initially, it was like 400 billionaires in the US, and we have 45 million poor people. It's now 618 billionaires, and there's a few, you know, 35 million poor people, although in the US, if you make $1 more, you're no longer poor. You know, you make $3 less than you're poor. And so, yeah, it's not an equal sum game, you know, where we're all gonna win. There'll be some big losers. But I mean, I think the bigger point is, you know, that for people on the bottom, even for white people on the bottom, that, you know, it is the old socialist moniker that we have a world to win. And without those kinds of politics that seek to actually look at how these different struggles are connected to each other, and you look at racism not as a way to just say, you're racist because you were born that way. Here's this kind of static phenomenon of racism. I mean, between Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, it's like, what is the way out, right? I mean, it's just, you're racist because you exist isn't really a politics. I mean, that's the pessimism versus here's a serious problem and here's the way out of it. And so, you know, that is part of the challenge, is getting ordinary people to see not what is the common denominator, but yeah, this is how racism also impacts me, even though it's not, I don't experience it. I'm a white person. I don't experience racism directly. But if the US government is going to spend $80 billion a year to maintain prisons and its criminal justice system, and it's using racism to do so, then that's a problem for me, even as a white person who doesn't directly experience racism. So those are more complicated arguments to make, but I don't know how we build the kind of movement and solidarity that is necessary to create the forces that have the capacity to force our government that is composed of millionaires and a handful of billionaires to change.
Thanks, Kianka. So I have two questions in the room. I'm going to start with Jack over here since you've got the mic, and then I'll pass it over there. But just one footnote on that, really, and on this question of kind of zero sums and whatnot. I mean, it has to be the case that, yes, from a certain perspective, right, there are going to be redistributions that might mean that there are some who are benefiting and others who aren't. But I take it that the whole idea of solidaristic coalition politics is that that is not perceived as a loss in a way, which is why I think that what's missing from the liberal critique of identity politics is precisely that. I mean, you know, yes, there may be inevitably there will be redistribution, one would hope, but that can't be perceived as a loss from a solidaristic coalition perspective in a way. And so that's where kind of then thinking about, you know, how on this text, you know, black women are liberated or protected, or, you know, it becomes definitional of, yeah, that's precisely the coalition and the solidarity that we would need. Okay, Jack Halberstam.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this presentation. It's been really interesting to go back to this text and think with it now in this moment. And there were a couple of things I was thinking about in terms of how clever the statement about identity politics is in the Combahee River Collective, because if no one but those black women will fight for black women, that implies that everything else that goes under the name of politics is already identity politics. It's already, as you said, the billionaires in the government are already fighting the good fight for their own outcome.
Right.
So I feel like the critique is already embedded in there. And I was thinking then about the goal of coalition that they articulate that comes back around in Moten's conversation with Stefano Hani in the Undercommons, when he says the coalition emerges out of your recognition that it's fucked up for you in the same way that we've already recognized that it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help, I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too, however much more softly, you stupid motherfucker, you know, right? So, I mean, that's kind of what you were saying, right, about coalition is that white people have to let go of a commitment to identity politics, even as in order for these kinds of coalitions to survive, there has to be some kind of identitarian statement. So I guess I wanted to say there are many versions of identity politics in play, even in the way they deploy it. But I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the way in which the Combahee River Collective statement gets taken up, you were saying, in relationship to struggles around sexuality and gender, or is being commemorated as such, but less so in relationship to socialism. And I was thinking about the fact that Born in Flames came out right around this time that the statement was issued. And in that film, if people remember, it was 1979, 1980, it came out. It's about a women's revolution from a group of black women who have not found that their political goals have been met under a socialist revolution. And so they take up arms, like literally take up guns and go to the Middle East to get guns to come back and fight the good fight. And so I'm wondering, whether whether there's a dawning recognition that even socialism is not going to deliver for the black women in this coalition and the political goals that they've outlined.
That's a great comment and question. So I think that there's probably three things at play. I mean, they say forthrightly in the statement that, we're socialists, but any socialist revolution that doesn't take up the question of black women's oppression is not one that, we want anything to do with. And so, I do think that there is probably a kind of commitment to the political ideas of socialism as a collective endeavor. So when they talk about workers create the wealth in society that should be fairly distributed, collectively owned, I think that is a commitment to a kind of socialist politics. I also think that the critique of socialist revolution that doesn't take black women's oppression seriously is also a critique of the kind of formal socialist revolutions that have already taken place. And so, the idea of third world women, which is how they describe themselves, means that they are in conversation cognizant of what is happening in the socialist world, what is happening in post-colonial societies that are erecting new governments in the name of socialism, describing themselves as socialists, and can look very clearly at the condition of women in those societies to come to a conclusion that this is not exactly what we have in mind. And so I think to that extent, they're two separate things, right? And I think that socialists have had this challenge for the last 100+ years, which is the distinction between states that rule in the name of socialism, whether it's big C communism or what it means to have communist states and socialist states in power and determining what the quality of life for ordinary people is, versus this idea of workers' power, collective ownership, and a notion of socialism from below, and that these two things are not collapsible unto each other. And I think that that is very much a part of the politics, the political whirlwind that they are in, certainly in the 1970s, and that, yes, that is absolutely a part of the critique. Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks, and thanks, Jack. Samira, and then I've got two questions coming in over the internet. So Samira first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, I have a very similar question to the one, the first question that was answered already. But so in Germany, we have this very strong debate, not about identity politics, not just coming from the conservative side and coming from the liberals, but coming from the radical left. And it's especially Marxists who criticize identity politics. For they see, so Marxist position would be class and the economic situation, and then you have this a special idea of identity politics, which points out not just identity, but like it radicalizes your standpoint, your position, and your identity. And there's kind of a conflict, right? So between solidarity and radicalizing the idea of a standpoint. And I'm still wondering, how do we get over this? So after I read this, your comment on the CRC statement and the statement itself, I feel like, okay, maybe the people who have this position on identity politics, that they are having a wrong understanding of identity politics.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would agree. I think, I think it's the same argument that to simply, just say that these issues of oppression and exploitation are only connected to class, ignores the, what Lenin described as the special oppression of oppressed nations, and that you could never expect that those people existing in oppressed nations would join the larger communist struggle unless you took their struggles seriously, unless you dealt with the specific forms of oppression that they were experiencing. And so, at a certain point in the history of socialism and communism in the United States, this was borne out in practice. The Socialist Party had a slogan, a kind of framework at the end of the 19th century, best articulated by Eugene Debs, who's actually articulated this even though it contradicted his personal practice, but the socialist movement has nothing special to offer black people, essentially. That once we win the class struggle and overthrow the bourgeoisie, then all the problems that black people face will disappear. And, some 30 years later, the Communist Party that forms in 1918, 1919, and 1920 come to a different conclusion because they see the ways that racism is being used to destroy the class movement. When there's a huge steel strike in 1919 across the Midwest. There are huge picket lines, and employers are picking up black workers in the South on trains, freight trains, and taking the trains right up to the picket line and deploying black workers to break the picket line in order to go essentially steal the jobs of these workers on strike. And so, if you don't take up the issues of racism and you don't actually take up the material conditions faced by black workers that lead them to be in this position, then you're not going to have any class struggle. And so in the United States, it was of paramount immediate importance that the communist movement, that the socialist movement take up the issue of racism, because the failure to do so was destroying the entire working class movement itself. And so in Germany, when the state is allowed to abuse immigrants, and that becomes a point of unity in the working class, it is undermining the ability of the workers' movement to fulfill its potential. It's reinforcing, reactionary as it may be, but reinforcing ideas and the power of the state. And so the left doesn't have to take up this issue, but it will take itself up, in actual real life if people continue to ignore it.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for that. Yeah, we had also in the writings for today also placed that context as well, the Marxist critique, and I think you hear it well, for instance, in some of Zizek's writings, where he tries to say something about the more fundamental nature of class conflict, right? That the permanence of it, the different layer, a more universal contradiction there. And I think you also get it a lot in the debate over race, caste, and class right now, and particularly in response to Wilkerson's book, Caste, so that those particular conflicts are coming up. And I think it's entirely right that, it's got to be a fine analysis that understands the way in which those dimensions relate to each other, and not obviously some kind of hierarchy. but to analyze exactly how they relate in particular context, in the kind of exactly the kind of context you were talking about, where, you know, black workers would be used to break a strike, or alternatively weren't admitted into a union, right? You know, the history that Du Bois talks about in Black Reconstruction. So, terrific. Okay, I've got two questions coming in that I think I'll pose, and then I think we'll wrap it up. So the first one is from Basuli Deb, and she writes, since we are at the People's Forum, a question about transnational alliances will perhaps be apposite. The CRC statement says, quote, the inclusiveness of our politics makes us concerned with any situation that impinges upon the lives of women, third world, and working people. So can you speak about transnational alliances between CRC's black activists and Global South activists then and now that resulted from CRC's politics of inclusion, and how did this play out in CRC's relationship with black nationalism as well as the US labor movement? And what key literary productions came out of such transnational feminist alliances, since so much of the CRC was associated with the literary? So that was one of the questions. And the other kind of brings us back, it's from Susan Tucker, a friend and a great scholar as well. Could you please discuss Afro-pessimism vis-a-vis the hopeful or optimistic possibility of radical systematic transformation? So in connection with the conversation we were having about kind of how issues of kind of relentless critique, I suppose, lead to a possible optimism, but in relationship also to Afro-pessimism. So maybe we'll take those as the two last questions and then try and wrap it up. Ha.
Okay. Let me just say about the first one in transnationalism, which in the context of the CRC, I'll describe as internationalism. You know, I think that it was a critical, and you know, you can read that in the statement itself. It's a critical aspect of their politics, and I think that that also is part of the kind of wider the context within which the CRC emerges. That internationalism was a core feature of black radical politics at this time, and you know, part of that you know, has to do with first the wave of anti-colonial struggles that are happening in the 1950s and 60s, but also then the national liberation struggles. And so there are active efforts to facilitate solidarity between oppressed peoples. And you know, I think that there, because of anti-colonial and national liberation struggles, that there develops an aspect of black political consciousness that allies itself with the third world, that sees itself as part of the third world, probably most dramatically demonstrated through the internal colony thesis and the idea that black people in the United States were themselves a colonized population. And so I think, you know, those kinds of politics are animating the analysis of the CRC when they talk about imperialism, when they talk about third world women. It's not just a kind of moniker for black women, is that they see themselves as part of an international movement of black women. And so, you know, this, of course, changes, you know, not just for the Combahee River Collective, which is a small, you know, I think this is also, it's a small organization of perhaps 40 women at its height, and certainly by 1978, when they write the statement, it is a shell of that. It's a, you know, it's a fraction of that. So, you know, I feel like sometimes I think because of the importance of the statement, that it lends us to thinking that the group is much larger and much more involved than it actually is. And so, you know, I do think that when we think about this period, and then again, you know, more recently, 2014 to the current period, that, you know, the questions of internationalism have changed, and that is contextual as well as political. It's not that it doesn't exist. Obviously, it exists in some forms and capacities, but not to the extent that it did in the 1960s and 1970s. And a lot of that, you know, has to do with the question of what happened to national liberation struggles, what happened to the national liberation movements, what happens when the rebels assume power. And these are questions that are asked in the United States as well. What happens in the post-60s, post-civil rights period when the radicals get the keys to the city and they are the ones in charge now. They are the ones making the decisions. That is happening internationally. And so the whole thrust of solidarity in the 1960s was around lending support to these nationalist, national liberation movements from the belly of the beast. That changes over time. The second, I mean, there's, you know, I mean, we could have a seminar, a conference about that questions. There's a million different things to say about it. Afro-pessimism or Afro-optimism. I don't know. I mean, I think that, you know, the only thing I'll say about it is in relation to the statement is I think that these women are less concerned about the fixity of racism than they are about what are the mechanisms necessary to overcome this. And I think that is part of what they are trying to identify in providing a structural analysis to the oppression of Black women, is to say that this is not timeless. This is not a permanent feature of human society, that it has a beginning, its origins are here. And, you know, we think that part of identifying the origins means that this is something that we can actually end. And that is the work that we have dedicated our lives to. And so, you know, to me, that this is a rejection of the idea that this is a kind of fixed state that is perhaps not unchanging, but certainly unchangeable. I think that, you know, that is antithetical to the core of their politics. So.
All right, thank you so much, Kianga. So maybe the place to end this session is there's this, I love the comments that you included by Barbara Ransby at the Socialism Conference, 2017, I think it was. And Barbara gives this kind of, you know, synthetic take on, you know, what can you pull? It's a great statement. And there's this passage where she's talking about the three things, or the heart and spirit of the politics of the Combahee River Collective Statement. A couple of things. One, you know, never be afraid to speak truth to power in the face of racist, misogynist threats of violence and attacks. When you have the impulse of either fight or flight, what do? Fight. And it's this third one, though, that I wanted to focus on, in a way, because I think it is something about also the directedness or bluntedness of worldly philosophers, in a way. that I'm chalking here and I need to develop elsewhere. But it's this always that, always, and so the way it's stated here, and I think this captures so well the questions of identity politics that we've been talking about here. Always ally yourself with those on the bottom, on the margins, and at the periphery of the centers of power. And in doing so, you will land yourself at the very center of some of the most important struggles of our society and our history. And I think in a way that captures a lot of the, unique way in which they were thinking about identity in the collective and in the way that we can think about it today as well. So please join me in thanking Kianga for a terrific presentation. Thank you so much for joining us for Revolution 1313. And thank you so much to the People's Forum for hosting us. David, for all the work back there. Thank you to everyone at the Union for making this possible. And join us on December 15th. I think that's the next date. December 15th, we'll be reading Rosa Luxemburg in conversation with both Lenin and Bernstein. So, all right. See you next time. Thank you.